The markets today are confusing, I think, to a lot of people. I think if you're not a little confused, you're not really paying attention to what's going on. Uh, there's stuff that on the macroeconomic environment you have to pay attention to, inflation, and then you have monetary policy where the Fed is raising rates. I think that the pandemic and everything that happened to it pretty much altered the history of the economy in ways that we can't even fathom right now. I think people are going to look back.
How so? Like what happened?
Well, people are going to look back at this period because for years and years, inflation was low, and that was the biggest problem people were worried about, right? The Fed is keeping interest rates at zero, and they're printing all this money, and they're pushing on a string, and inflation just isn't happening. A lot of people are just beating their heads against their desks saying, why shouldn't everyone own gold right now? And why isn't the Fed crashing the system? And why are stocks still doing good? And then the pandemic came along, and the government spent all this money to keep the economy afloat, and as we sort of put it on ice. And I think then people realize, like, oh, right, the Fed itself is not really the main, Wizard of Oz here. It's the government spending that matters, because that's money going into people's pockets. People are spending that money. That's really what did it with inflation. But I mean, if you look at any economic chart over the past 3 years, unemployment, retail spending, any of this stuff, you see this stuff fall off a cliff and then spike back up. And now we're in that kind of phase where things are trying to sort of level out and people are trying to figure out what's going on. And I think that there's just so much stuff that's going on that's confusing because we have inflation that's the highest it's been in 40 plus years. You have people who think we're in a recession right now. You have people who think we're going to be in a recession soon, or the Fed's going to push us there. You have people who think, no, actually things are actually okay right now. And you have the housing market that just went bananas for 24 months. All this stuff that's going on. And I think the problem for our sort of primitive brains is that when stuff happens this fast, I think it's hard for people to really understand what is going on. And markets now more than ever are just speeding up. The cycles are faster and faster. And you're seeing moves that you've never, it seems like once a week you see a headline that says, thing that has never happened before is happening now. And so,
Right.
I would color myself in that camp too, that it's a very confusing time.
So you would expect that unemployment and a crashing stock market and recession would all be correlated, but in fact, they're not here. I mean, it's hard to get your head around what's really going on.
That's the other bizarre thing, that it's hard to, there's a lot of people who just are cynical these days and pessimistic and only want to look at the downside. So obviously inflation is not good. I'm not going to be one of the people who say inflation is good, but you have people in the labor market who people were shouting for years, why is minimum wage still $7.25 an hour, whatever it is? And now effectively the pandemic, for all intents and purposes, lifted minimum wage. And the people on the low end of the income scale have gotten wage increases that they've never seen in their entire lives. And I think that wouldn't have happened had the pandemic not happened. And obviously inflation hurts those households a lot because they're the ones that see the right to their budget, right? The things like gas prices, and they make up a higher percentage of that. But these people have also seen the biggest wage spikes of anyone. So when the pandemic first started, my whole thinking was this is going to make inequality worse because rich people are going to be fine. They don't have to go into a job they don't want to go to. They can buy stocks on the cheap when they're down 30%, and they're going to come out better than ever. And surprisingly, the group that has done the best is like the lowest income quartile. Their wages have risen the most. They've seen the bottom 50% has seen, on a relative basis, their wealth increase the most on a percentage terms since the start of the pandemic. It's very surprising. I think a lot of the stuff that happened in the past few years would be shocking to people if they really dug into the numbers.
So I posted this snarky image on my Instagram the other day. It was a 4th of July themed image with like a party invitation. And I said, welcome to 9.1% inflation, everybody. And I said, trillions in government handouts leads us to this, presents this thing. And somebody posted, Brad Shelton, who you are, posted on there, said, if this is the cause of inflation, why is inflation happening in other countries as well? And I didn't have a strong answer for him. Were there government handouts in other countries, or can inflation not be contained in one geographic area?
I do think it's a more globalized world. There's different kinds of inflation. Here, I really think people underestimate how much we just love to consume. We love spending money in this country. And when we got that money, that's what we just bought stuff. So like even adjusted for inflation, retail sales are way higher than they were if you would have just followed the pre-pandemic trend, right? And now people decided like, well, I don't want to buy as much stuff anymore. I want to go out and experience stuff. So that's why we're seeing there's a bunch of other reasons for it, but all the travel problems, right? Because people decided, all right, I've been putting off trips for 2 or 3 years. I'm taking all these trips I can. In other countries, a lot of it is energy, but you're right that what'd you say his name was? Brad
Shelton.
It's a good comeback to say, because inflation is as high as it's been in the UK for 40 years too. A lot of those other countries did perform some stimulus programs, not nearly as large as us in most of them. But I do think, again, the pandemic screwed a lot of things up. And I think the supply chain problems that it caused, I think that's a big part of this. The labor market stuff that caused, people who had to drop out of the labor force to take care of their kids, or people who dropped out of the labor force for health reasons. I think just it was a giant monkey wrench that got thrown into the system. And if you went back and told us and I said this on my podcast at the time, with all this spending, because you could see it, we're spending more than we have since World War II.